Thanks.
I've been working on a couple of amendments for our consideration, thinking that we can merge it together perhaps in one amendment, and welcome your thoughts and considerations. One of the amendments is to address the whole question of trails. We've heard testimony about this. As you know, our current draft does not contemplate a management approach about trails, and yet we know that the partners, through their testimony and the presentation of the original language that we saw, they've been working on it for at least a couple of years, and they're very close. But they recognize that they still needed some clarity over the course of the next year to two before they would come to us by next year with a proposal of what this a public trails management program would look like. And so with respect to that one, I have been working with our ledge council and the rural caucus, which were also very interested in having a trails component to the Act 250 bill, to arrive at some language for this amendment that I now have just circulated it. And I apologize for not getting it in front of you earlier, but I worked all weekend on it, and I still hadn't received final word from the Commissioner of Forest Parks and Recreation whether the language is sufficient for their purposes. But I know that they had a instrumental role in crafting this language, so I'm hopeful it meets their intent. And you all will have that now in front of you. I sent it to you individually just now, and a copy is with Mark. It is in draft form, but at least you could see that it contemplates, as I described, two things. One is a recommendation to us through a report due this coming December about a program that deals with trails, and then the greater clarity to eliminate some uncertainty regarding trails and trail management in the context of Act 250 for this interim period. The second element is, as you know, this draft bill that we voted out of our House contemplated some exemptions for state designation areas. The state has 5 state designations for downtown areas. They're all intended to concentrate development where there's the resources and where there's intent, as reflected in those town plans, for example. Our bill looks at 2 of those designations and pulls them into our bill to exempt Act 250, where due to having these 2 state designations, there's confidence that at the local level, those municipalities have the capacity to manage smart growth and align their development patterns through smart growth principles, in their designated downtown areas. Those 2 designations included downtown development districts and the neighborhood development area designation. This second amendment addresses a village development district or enhanced village designation, village center designation. And it provides a path forward for those communities that have village center designations or would like to have a village center designation. Those designations are for revitalizing those smaller downtown areas, and the intent is of providing a path forward for those communities that have a town plan, zoning and subdivision regulations, that they too can potentially help to find that efficiencies through having that at the local level managed development and aligned with those smart growth principles. So that is a second amended language, and right now we made that request for our ledge council to put that, what would that look like in our language to pull that designation into our bill as an amendment.
Great. Welcome, Ellen.
Hello.
Carrie, excuse me for eating. It's been Good day. Carrie just gave us an overview of her work on amendments over the weekend. Maybe you can give us an overview of what the world looks like from your perspective right now. Have you been in touch with the Appropriations Committee, or do you know what they're up to?
Czajkowski, Office of Legislative Counsel. I just emailed the Appropriations Committee to tell them I am here until they call me, and I asked them to either email me or Mark when they are ready. They had about an hour ago told me they might be hearing from me around 2:30, but I don't know how accurate that is. So the Appropriations Committee is taking up an amendment. It is the amendment it is very similar to the amendment we talked about on Friday. It is striking the references to updating the board. So, like the amendment we discussed in here on Friday, it would revert the board back to the status quo of existing law.
And do you have a sense of, we made some changes to that amendment that we thought we would be introducing that took the board out. How many changes, what's the difference between them just removing the board and what we went through on Friday?
Off the top of my head, I think it's just 2 sections that you added the language about when the governor appoints members to the board, having the board reflect diversity, so the various descriptions you added to that. That was in section 6021. And then 6027 is the powers of the board, and in that section you added the ability for the board to hear the certain appeals of the state designations, the municipal bylaws related to interstate interchanges, and something else. Approve regional plans. So those 2 sections I did not put in the appropriations strike all because they weren't in the underlying bill. So I think you could add them to your amendment.
Okay, and so what we are contemplating right now is an amendment that would make those changes to their amendment,
Mm-hmm.
and then also consider the trails amendment and the village centers. And then in reading the bill over the weekend, I had a couple questions, things that I thought were either in or out that are in now. So, did others find other things of concern before you read the bill? And Carol?
When I was working on just writing about what's in this bill, I became concerned about the number of lots that trigger jurisdiction. And we don't have any difference in the 10 lots divided to trigger the jurisdiction. And I wonder,
That's fine, but we don't, you're right, we can change jurisdiction there. Any other thoughts?
Was there, when you talked about appeals, there was some discussion as to who would appeal, where an appeal would go of a jurisdictional opinion. And where did we wind up with that?
The way that it currently works, which is to the environmental court.
Not to the NRB.
Correct.
And we just left it alone? That's kind of how you saw it, or how it's?
Yes.
See, I thought it was either going to the NRB or back to the district commission. We were not going to bring that to the court.
We did discuss currently that there is a reconsideration process. Someone can request a reconsideration, which goes to the, so we discussed a few things. I was under the impression we were going with the status quo. I did not think a change
I
was.
think we decided to stay with the status quo. And so the way it goes now, Paul, the district coordinator issues a jurisdictional opinion,
Yes,
and then it can be reconsidered.
by her, or he, or him, right? He'll-
Right.
The person who wrote it will reconsider it.
And then you can also go to the board for reconsideration, right, Ellen?
That's what I'm trying to nail down, where that goes. And I know we had a discussion whether or not about district commission or NRB.
I think you have a choice. You can take it to NRB or you can take it to the court. And Evan, you might know the answer, so if you could help.
How, in the existing, in
Yeah.
the 57, the new 57-page bill,
The current system that we're operating under, yes.
as the law exists right now, and the question is where appeals go?
What do the JO, what do you?
Oh, the JO appeals go to the court. And reconsiderations go back to the same coordinator who issued the original JO. That's how it works.
Right, so there's a JO and I'm questioning it.
Yep.
I could have a reconsideration, but I think I can also take it to the NRB for reconsideration.
No.
Okay. I go to the district coordinator and then straight to the court.
That's right. And then the board is a party to that JO appeal. But I'm combing through the 57-page bill now, and it's not clear to me whether or not on page 14 the board would no longer be a party. There's a change. There's some language that was struck. The board might not be a party anymore.
Oh, you're looking at the draft that's from 219.
From 221, H.926, draft 1.1, page 14, lines 6 through 8. It strikes the language, the Natural Resources Board may participate as a party in all matters before the environmental division that relate to land use permits issued under this chapter.
The committee asked me to unstrike that.
So in the next iteration, unstruck.
It is unstruck.
Okay, so I think what we should do is hear, so help me out, Ellen. Does it make sense for us to hear the amendments next? Proposed trail amendment?
Sure.
Can you walk us through that, please? And is it up under
It is.
you?
Yep.
It might not.
It's not.
That's what I was asking if you can post it. Sorry, I will post that right now.
Great.
The newest, Ellen, should I use the one that you use for appropriations? Is that the same?
No. It's the
draft
Dolan
2.1
amendment,
It
and
says
it is
Dolan amendment.
It's on the website.
11/20, yeah.
I'm sorry, that is not the same one. Never mind.
Okay, walk us through this one.
Alright, so this is language related to recreational trails as submitted by the stakeholders to that process. So the first incident of amendment is adding a new section 3A, which amends 10 VSA 442(3) to read, trails means land used for hiking, walking, bicycling, cross-country skiing, snowmobiling, all-terrain vehicle riding, horseback riding, or other similar activities. Trails may be used for recreation, transportation, or other compatible purposes. Trails does not include land primarily used for the operation of a motor vehicle. For purposes of this definition, motor vehicles shall not include all-terrain vehicles or snowmobiles. So this is in Title 10 in the Vermont Trails System chapter. The next change, so now we're looking at Act 250, Section 3, 10 VSA 6001, the definition section of Act 250, we're adding two definitions. First, recreational trail shall have the same meaning as trails in subdivision 442.3 of this title, which is the language above. And Vermont Trails System Trail means a recreational trail recognized by the Agency of Natural Resources pursuant to section 443 of this title. The construction, operation, and maintenance of a Vermont trail system trail shall be for a municipal or state purpose under this chapter. Next, also under section 6001, now we're in the definition of development. So this is a jurisdictional threshold. So starting on page 2, the construction of improvements for a Vermont trail system trail on a tract or tracts of land involving more than 10 acres. This subdivision shall be the exclusive mechanism for determining jurisdiction over a new or a proposed recreational trail that is or will be a part of the Vermont Trails system. This subdivision shall apply to the construction of improvements made on or after July 1, 2020.
Do we do questions now or later?
Let's get through the whole thing and then do questions.
For purposes of this subdivision, involved land includes infrastructure that is necessary for the operation of the trail, including restrooms, parking areas, shelters, picnic areas, kiosks, and interpretive and directional signage. Involved land does not include any recreational trail constructed before July 1, 2020. The total acreage of involved land shall include any ground disturbance and clearing that will occur. Area where no ground will be disturbed or cleared shall not be considered involved land. Development and subdivisions requiring a permit under another provision of this chapter shall include recreational trails for determining the amount of involved land that relates to the development, but shall not consider the construction of improvements related to the trail as a part of the review of that permit application. Page 3. Section 6001, we're still in the definition section of Act 250. Recreational trails. Jurisdiction over a recreational trail shall extend only to the recreational trail and infrastructure that is necessary for the operation of the trail. Jurisdiction shall not extend to the rest of a parcel or parcels where a recreational trail is located. Next, instance number 5, we're in section 6081, which is where the exemptions are. So, no permit or permit amendment shall be required for the construction of improvements on a tract of land that would provide access across a trail, provided that the access is not related to the use of the permitted recreational trail and would not establish jurisdiction under 10 VSA Chapter 151 on its own. And section 6, adding a new section, recreational trail recommendations and report. On or before December 15th, 2020, the Agency of Natural Resources shall report to the House Committee on Natural Resources, Fish and Wildlife, and to the Senate Committee on Natural Resources and Energy with legislative recommendations for a best management practices driven program for Vermont trail system trails that includes technical assistance, education, and oversight from the Agency of Natural Resources. This report shall include recommendations for a strategic plan and comprehensive mapping, legislative authority to administer the program, and potential funding sources. The Agency of Natural Resources shall consult with stakeholders on the proposed program, including the Vermont Trails Alliance, the Forest Partnership, and the Vermont Agency of Transportation. And then the effective date section is amended to also include a sunset. So section 6001 3A, which is the jurisdictional trigger added, shall be repealed on January 1, 2022.
trail, can we go back to that and understand that jurisdictional trigger that is added again, revisit that?
Sure, so it's on page 2.
Page 2, which line?
It starts at the top of the page. So, so this is section 6001, under the definition of development. So, development shall include the construction of improvements for a Vermont trail system trail on a tract or tracts of land involving more than 10 acres.
This is the way it is now in statute.
It's not in statute, this is the
It's in
rule.
And this, as it's written, only applies to trails built after July 1, 2020. And then it gets repealed whether or not we stand up another program.
Yes.
So then would we revert back to the rules? And, I mean, this is not meeting what I thought it was gonna do. If it were repealed, would we revert back to the current status quo of the rules and I don't know, and Evan, do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, I mean,
I suppose there's some uncertainty there because it depend. I mean, it might depend upon the degree to which the board engages in rulemaking to modify the existing rule to make it clear that this is the system that's going to be in place until January of 2022, and then it might be incumbent upon the board to do some more rulemaking in 2022 in order to reinstitute either the old system or an improved system. Maybe something will happen during this interim period that we'll realize the rule should exist in a different format and we'll enact a modified rule instead. So it's a little uncertain.
Jim?
I'd like to make it more certain. I'm categorically against the sunset of this whole section. Have been since the first time I saw it, and remain that way. If we wanted to rely on the agency to come up with the plan that we asked them to do in the report and stand up a whole different way of dealing with it, they in that report, they could make the recommendation that would strike this rule and take it out of Act 250 jurisdiction. But taking it out of Act 250 jurisdiction pending a report that's relying on a group of very well-meaning people who have been working on it for a couple of years already and have not gotten anything concrete, and then takes a jurisdiction away from Act 250, I find that totally unacceptable for the committee that's protecting and changing Act 250. On that same vein, if we go on to page 2, Roman numeral 5, line 16. I'm not even sure why that needs to be in here. There was agreement to take it out, and then it got back in, and I think that's a gimme. So I'm not supportive of that either.
Which one?
Roman numeral 5.
I don't understand what that's trying to do.
I don't
It's
either.
really confusing, and I guess someone who's advocating for it needs to bring it up now. Jamey?
Try and offer an explanation. There was, as we were reviewing this, there was acknowledgement that you could have a trail operation that has trails as part of it, but also has a commercial component to it. Think a restaurant, a brewery. There's something that's commercial that goes along with the trail network. And this was an attempt to say that for purposes of trails being codified now as a state purpose and looking at whether there's 10 acres of disturbance, that for the commercial component, you wouldn't create a loophole with that commercial component wouldn't be considered a state purpose automatically. So in other words, this was an attempt at drafting language to say that development subdivisions requiring a permit under another provision of this, meaning that it's commercial. It's not a state purpose, it's not a municipal purpose like you're saying for trails here, but it's commercial. Then for those, when you look at the amount of involved land for that project, you look at the restaurant and you look at the trails too, because that's all an involved project. The trails themselves will be reviewed separately as a state purpose, but you don't create a loophole for commercial development and limit the jurisdiction of that by just saying you just look at the commercial component without considering that there's an involved project of trails too. I don't know if that helps to clarify it, but this was essentially a way to try and make sure that we weren't creating a loophole in Act 250 for the commercial components of development that would normally be reviewed. And while there was an attempt here to offer clarifications for the trails, this was the best way to say, to keep it status quo for the commercial nature of how you would calculate involved land.
We'll go ahead, Ellen.
Right, so there's the tricky thing with this language is that currently commercial and industrial development, the land involved is calculated by ownership. So, but with a state and municipal purpose, it relates to disturbance. And so we're there's the potential that these two things could mix because we're singling out a type of project that is for state or municipal purpose. Under the rest of the statute, things that are for a state or municipal purpose are usually owned by the state or municipality.
So I think it seems to me like if someone was gonna build a commercial related purpose, a brewery, it would still trigger Act 250, separate from, how would it be conflated with this exemption, which is what this is?
I don't think it's meant to operate as an exemption per se, but to say that if you're, in order to calculate the amount of involved land for that commercial endeavor, you look at the restaurant and you look at the trails, and then you determine, does that have the amount of acreage to trigger Act 250 for reviewing the commercial component of that project.
Okay.
And so it's just a way of not creating a loophole and just saying you just look at the restaurant and you ignore the fact that it's part of a trail system. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it is.
So,
Is it doing that?
Yeah.
I was gonna ask, if I'm one of the property owners in which a trail goes through, and they put something like a snack shack or something like that, it's clearly visible if you're on the trail, and offers you a sandwich or a drink. The way this language reads now, the fact that it's on the periphery of a trail does not give it a waiver or a pass of a 250 jurisdiction. It would have to apply for its own 250 permit in order to operate. Is that correct?
This is Evan Meenan from the Natural Resources Board. So generally, this language would treat your commercial sales of snacks differently from the recreational trails for determining if jurisdiction is triggered. That does not necessarily mean, however, that all snack shacks would trigger jurisdiction. I mean, if there's a couple kids out there with a lemonade stand with no permanent improvements, they might very likely be able to qualify under the de minimis exception to Act 250 jurisdiction. But if somebody's building like, a snack shack with a full kitchen the size of this room, and they otherwise meet the acreage thresholds, well then they probably will trigger jurisdiction, notwithstanding the special treatment of trails.
What if I was selling T-shirts, cross-country or trail T-shirts?
It would be the same kind of analysis that would apply to the lemonade stand.
It wouldn't change in terms of, it wouldn't constitute a commercial development.
It depends upon the magnitude. If there's a chance it could qualify for de minimis, but if you're essentially running a souvenir shop and you've constructed improvements for the purposes of doing that, and you're selling them to people, there is a good likelihood you will trigger Act 250 jurisdiction even if your primary customers are the trail users. There was a recent jurisdictional opinion, however, that was issued up in Victory. That's on appeal right now, so I can't comment too frequently on it, but there was a woman who was selling tickets out of her home, and that jurisdictional opinion on reconsideration, which is now public record, held that that woman did not need to get an Act 250 permit.
On reconsideration.
On reconsideration, that's right.
Tickets to what?
To trail users to access the trails.
Selling anything else? Did you sell the T-shirts as well?
She might have been.
Just checking.
So can someone help me understand why we're distinguishing Vermont trail system trails from recreational trails and then seeming not to distinguish them? They seem to, if you are a Vermont trail system trail, you're something, and then if you want to be one, you get the same consideration. Warren?
Sure, this is Warren Coleman with MMR on behalf of the Vermont Trail Alliance. So currently in statute, we're trying to make something explicit here to say Vermont trail systems are for public use. Right now in statute, in Act 250, there's the municipal threshold of 10 acres. If it's a municipal or state project, you get a 10-acre threshold. In the Vermont Trail System statute, it says Vermont trails are for a public purpose. And that's been interpreted, that public purpose has been interpreted to be a state purpose under Act 250. So we're trying to be explicit and put those two concepts in one place in statute here. So it's codifying what is existing law, but instead of making people look at two places, we're codifying it in one place in statute. So if you're a Vermont Trail Systems trail, probably the one regulatory benefit that you have is that the 10-acre threshold is what applies to you. If you are not a Vermont Trail Systems trail, and you happen to be in a 1-acre town, then that's you don't get the automatic benefit of having a 10-acre threshold. It can vary depending on where you are in the state.
And so would this exemption here apply to you?
When you say this exemption,
The
I'm not
whole
sure.
amendment is.
So that amendment is drafted to apply only to Vermont system trails, to basically say that we're recognizing that they're for a public purpose, the 10-acre threshold applies, and then what we're doing is adding a number of clarifications on how you determine if you reach that 10-acre threshold or not. One talks about that it's actual disturbance or clearing on the ground is how you add up to figure out whether you hit the 10 acres. The one we're talking about now is trying to make it clear that you don't, that and this is a rare instance, I think, in talking with folks, they haven't seen this, but if Representative LaFave decided he was going to build a set of mountain bike trails and a brewery, all at the, basically all at the same time under the same ownership, that there was a way to make sure that the brewery and restaurant didn't get the benefit necessarily of being part of the Vermont trail system for purposes of jurisdiction. On the flip side, for purposes of jurisdiction of looking at that the brewery restaurant, you actually would look at in other words, if you're on the commercial, looking at the commercial part, you actually include the trail system acreage for purposes of figuring out whether you have Act 250 jurisdiction. For purposes of the trail, you wouldn't. So we're trying to just, as Jamey said, make that distinction there. That's what's going on.
So on page 2, line 3, this subdivision shall be the exclusive mechanism for determining jurisdiction over a new or proposed recreational trail that is or will be part of the Vermont Trail System.
You want to know
I
why
can't
it's
find a list of Vermont Trail System trails, and I don't know how you become one.
Yep.
And I don't know how I would know if I was going to become one.
So we can actually bring Commissioner Snyder would be the best person, but it's a process where the Vermont Trails and Greenways Council looks at applications and makes a recommendation to the Vermont to Forest Parks and Recreation for inclusion in that. So that includes things like making sure they have best management practices, making sure they have the resources to maintain the trail.
Well, I went
There's
to
a
the
number
Vermont Trails and Greenways Council webpage and
Yeah.
found nothing about it.
There's not much there, you're right.
So what trails are in and out?
I don't have a complete list, but vast trails are in, trails are in. Most, VIMBA, the Mountain Bike Association, a good portion of their trails are in, but we can, I think Commissioner Snyder has a list. I don't have the list with me. So it is definitely a lot less than all recreational trails in the state, much less. So we're,
This thing that I'm asking about also includes proposed recreational trails that is or will be.
so that language is there because, at least historically, and I don't think this makes a lot of sense, but historically, Vermont trails have only become part of the Vermont trail system, after they're built, and then they apply for application. Well, that seems kind of, what we're talking about here is for new trails, if you plan to be and want to apply to be part of the Vermont Trail Systems trails. So that's why it says new or proposed. So a new section could be somebody that's got an existing section of trail and applies to be a member, or somebody that before they build it, which is the way it should ideally happen going forward, is that they say, I want to build this section of trail, I'd like to be part of the Vermont trail system.
And then to help me further understand, it seems to me that any existing trail is never going to be part of any of this regulatory scheme.
No, what we are trying to do here is really cover an interim period of trail building from the effective date of this bill until hopefully we and you stand up a new program. We're trying to create a clarification for a limited period of time to cover new trail building.
But existing trails would no longer be under the jurisdiction of anyone.
This does not exempt or change jurisdiction over any existing trail systems right now.
I'm just making sure my legislative council agrees with that.
So, currently, trails can trigger Act 250 jurisdiction, and so if a trail didn't fall under this new jurisdictional trigger, it could otherwise trigger under the general commercial development trigger.
Evan, did you want to? Oh, I already have Jim.
So that's the topic, I think, of the moment, line 6, page 2. No, it's not, but, line 11, involved land. Where is the part, Jim, about after the date certain?
It's at the end.
Involve, line 6, page 2. Yeah, line 6, page 2, subdivision shall not apply to the construction of improvements made on or prior to July 1st, 2020. On the face of it, most especially absent not having the sunset, this language stays, and additionally on the face of it, that exempts everything built prior to July 1st, 2020 from Act 250 review. That would include all bandit trails, all well-meaning trails, who didn't realize they needed to get an Act 250 permit, but it became obvious through one mechanism or another that they should have. And there's a mechanism for dealing with that, if it was a shoulda, coulda, woulda, and bring them under Act 250. Am I wrong about this, Evelyn?
I don't know what a bandit trail is.
It's one that's built oftentimes without the landowner's even knowledge, oftentimes without the municipal or state knowledge, consent, or advice. And it's some good old boys who decide to go out and wouldn't this be a great place for a trail? And so a trail gets built, and then so forget the word bandit. Maybe I shouldn't have used lightning language. But
So-
all trails built prior to July 1, 2020, I'm making assertion, would be outside of Act 250 jurisdiction, most especially if we don't do the sunset.
So, this section is adding definitions to be specific to Vermont trail system trails. So, existing non-trail system trails wouldn't fall under this.
Unless they wanted to become one. Which is the line I brought attention to.
And
Jamey and then Warren.
I can at least share that the intent here was not to necessarily grandfather illegally created or trails that should be under Act 250 jurisdiction, but have not been. It was more to address an issue that came up with a Kingdom Trails jurisdictional opinion, not the recent request as to whether the whole network's under review, but there was a part of the network up there in East Haven called Moose Haven that a segment was built, and the district coordinator said, moving forward, if you continue to add on to these trails, at some point you may trigger Act 250. And so the idea here was to say that there needed to be some clarification on this issue, one way or another, to address the policy, because that's not my understanding is that's not necessarily a clear rule across the Natural Resources Board, but this was in one instance, and the idea was that if that started to be applied to any trail that's built that's connected to an existing network, the entire network may come under Act 250 jurisdiction. And we just thought it would be helpful that if the major effort right now is to move all resources into creating this new program, and at the same time trails comprehensively were coming under Act 250, that it could potentially make things more complicated than trying to build this new program and move the trail review through that. So that was a policy decision that was recommended there. It wasn't meant to say that any trail that's been built would no longer be considered involved land to understand whether those networks should have triggered review on their own. That would be determined through a JO. So if there's clarification that's needed there, I guess I would just say from my perspective, we didn't intend to have that application. It was just for the new segments that are being built to offer clarity on this point for an interim point in time, and that Representative McCullough is why we were recommending that at sunset, because we were not, or I would speak at least for VNRC and the Forest Partnership groups, comfortable with that policy being durable, meaning long-term. It was just meant to support it as a clarifying provision in this moment in time while we're all working to build this new program, but not to have it be a long-lasting policy that you would, just look at it segment by segment and divorce it from the context of a larger network it may be connecting to. It was meant as an interim policy just to get us through this short period of building the program.
so the Council's clarification makes sense. We're just talking about here the Vermont Trails System, and I'm probably going to go out on a limb here and say I'm betting there are Vermont Trails systems, identified systems that developed organically, and that's a better way to put it. Developed organically, and then at some point got the blessing because it would seem to be appropriate to be part of the Vermont Trails system. And in that organic development, shoulda, coulda, woulda, maybe gotten Act 250 approval, but had not. So I think really this does give amnesty to anybody after July 1 or prior to July 1, 2020. And if this whole section is not intended to be durable and is only dependent upon the sunset after the agency develops something, I'm troubled. I'm just gonna say.
I think I need someone to just get back to just plain English. What is the problem you're trying to solve with this language?
You wanna take a crack at it? So we're talking about the same provision that Jamey just explained?
I'm
trying
talking
to-
about the entire amendment.
The
What is
entire-
the problem you're trying to solve?
The entire amendment is trying to, for an interim period of time, add clarity by codifying a number of things that are in rule or in multiple places of statute, to make it clear to landowners what their obligations are and are not, if there's Act 250 jurisdiction on a trail, to basically make it clear that Act 250 doesn't apply. And I know that's under Rule 71, but clearly that's a source of confusion. So to try to make it clear, if there is an Act 250 jurisdiction trail on your trail and you need to build a road across it, you don't have to go to get an Act 250 amendment. And it's also to provide a period of time where the confusion over if I go to build 2 miles of trail and I'm connecting to existing trail, which most trails we want to connect to existing trails, that we're not going to have to go through this exercise of figuring out, does the connecting trail, the piece that I'm connecting to, what is the history of that, and does that somehow get added to my new 2 miles of trail for purposes of figuring out jurisdiction. We're just trying to say for this interim period of time, for new trails, for Vermont system trails, new trails, these are the rules of the road. That's all we're trying to do, is say for this limited period of time. That's what we're trying to do, and we're trying to add that clarity because Act 250 is going to exist for this period of time. And the reason it's sunset is because we didn't think that you would want to make a lot of these things permanent, that you would want to hold our feet to the fire and say, folks, get this done, and if you don't, you're going to go back to a system that nobody thinks is actually functioning the way it should be. So that's what this is about.
Well, so, and then that's all good, except you're exempting everything that's
We're
built
not.
prior to July 1, 2020.
We're not. We're saying
So
for
can we
purposes.
strike those
No,
words?
no. I think that's one of the issues that's important for clarity. What it's saying is, if you're a Vermont system trail, and you're going to build 2 miles of trail this year, that you don't include, for purposes of determining what's involved land, recreational trails that were constructed in the past. We're saying we're not going to have a look back onto what you're connecting to for this period of time. It doesn't mean that older trail system is exempt whatsoever, because this is only speaking to the new part of trail that's being built going forward. It's just saying we're not going to look at the old trail for purposes of your jurisdiction. It is not exempting that section of trail. If somebody doesn't add to it, no one's changing the status. If there's a section of trail out there and no one's building onto it, we're not changing the state of affairs for that portion of trail right now. It's not what this is doing. It's trying to just add that clarity about when you're adding to it.
Paul, and then Carrie.
Yeah, I think I like this because I think what you're telling me is that what exists now will exist as status quo. And what comes between now and September 21st, 2021 will have to more or less comply with the rules of this amendment, what this amendment offers to, in terms of regulatory authority as to building a new trail. But is the end goal to take trails out of 250 entirely?
Yes, the end goal is to create a new program at A&R that, like the last paragraph says, is a BMP-driven program that's administered by A&R. Because what we have a lot more trail networks and organizations be a part of that program, rather than, quite frankly, what we have is a very ad hoc field out there of what's in, what's not subject to Act 250, what is, how do you determine that? There's anything but consistency in how things have been applied. So what we're trying to do is create something where there's a reason people want to be part of that program, and to bring everybody up to the same set of standards, which is going to be, quite frankly, a far better system and cover a lot more of our trail networks than what's currently out there.
And new trails are not then put on hold until this is more or less resolved. If I wanted to build a trail, what would I say this summer?
That's what we're trying to do, is provide guidance for Vermont system trails for this interim period. These are the rules you have to play by. The 10-acre threshold is there, which is already an existing law. The way you calculate 10 acres is by disturbance, whether it's ground disturbance or it's clearing. That's exactly what we're trying to do, is provide clarity for this interim period so that things can continue to function while we try and stand up a new program. It's exactly what we're doing.
And when I would go before a district commission, or would I go before another board if I wanted to build a new program?
It would be the same administration through Act 250. We're just clarifying what those thresholds are and how you calculate and determine jurisdiction. That's all we're doing. We're not trying to change anything other than provide clarity on what the rules are now under the existing framework.
I mean, I guess I'm wondering about, I'm not sure it's providing clarity. It just doesn't seem clear to me. I hear what you're trying to do better now. I also think if we're codifying what's in rule now and we don't stand up a program, why would we repeal it?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, there are one, it holds our feet to the fire. I mean, quite frankly, my guess is we're not going to repeal. We're not going to let this. We're not going to fall victim to that. Where we're going to say, you know what, we didn't figure it out, so let's just go back to the old system. We've got to create something different.
Well, I'm not sure you were in the room when we had a couple of legal opinions that were not sure that it's clear to go back to the current system when this is repealed.
You mean under this amendment, or are you talking about more broadly Act 250?
Under
I'm sorry.
this amendment.
Well, I don't think we're changing anything fun. I will say there are pieces of this that are the kind of things that, if we ended up sticking with Act 250 long term, the clarification on how you determine jurisdiction or codifying Rule 71, there are some things that we should do regardless. I think there's a couple pieces in here that, quite frankly, keep the pressure on the groups to get things done. In particular, the division we've been talking about, Roman numeral 3.
Carrie.
I just want to reiterate, and I appreciate the input. I just want to reiterate a couple of things, that this is not a moratorium, so that's an important signal to the part of our economy that relies on trails. It's not an exemption. We're talking about a limited, finite period of time. And it's all in the context of Act 250. That report with recommendations is actually silent as to whether it's in or out Act 250. It could be within the context of Act 250. In that analysis, it may be that this framework would reside as a component within the Act 250 framework. But we leave it up for that process in developing those recommendations. So I just wanted to be clear, if we were to, say, go the opposite direction and say that new trails would bring the existing trail network into the Act 250 processes specific to those new trails, number one, that would provide a chilling effect of that economic development. But the other thing is that the period of time in which we would be making that decision and affecting the outcomes of those Act 250 processes would go well beyond this limited interim period that we're talking about. So I see this as a practical way that maintains the integrity of what we're trying to accomplish here, with some clarity that is obviously in demand, and a path forward to ensure that we are promoting the sound best practices that we need to get on the ground with respect to this type of development.
Jim.
It is important for the committee to know, and I can only suggest feebly how much effort Carrie has put into this since 5 o'clock Friday afternoon, including submissions at 1:52 a.m. On certain days, and some of my concerns have been answered. I'm still a little I'm still a little queasy on a development subdivision requiring a permit under another provision, but, I think minds that are more in tune to that say, get over it, Jim, it's okay. What is not okay for me is the sunset. And I believe that the rationale for the sunset as just something to keep their feet on the fire at A&R, doesn't work for me. Nor does it work to keep the feet on the fire of the Trails Consortium, who's been working on this for a long time. And it would appear to me that that whole section does add clarity to what's going on right now. And I would strike the amnesty of trails built prior to a date certain. But with the sunset out of there, the plan visioned in the report can absolutely do everything we would want it to do, including a recommendation that take over completely jurisdiction of trails from Act 250. I'm not seeing anything in here about they're doing rulemaking, and so I can only assume, but it's not in there, that they will bring their report. Well, no, it does say they're bringing their report back to us with legislative recommendations. So they are making legislative recommendations. Those recommendations could include taking Act 250 out of the jurisdiction of trails, and presumably if that was what they came up with, good rationale, this committee would seriously consider it and likely act favorably on it. But to just repeal it with nothing on the whiteboard to balance against it, only hope, and I'll say hope is not a plan. So that's my 2 cents.
Carrie?
I know this committee has in the past used repeal language in relatively short periods of time on other policy questions in order to provide for that opportunity to revisit the policy question at hand. Clean water is an example where the initial surcharge on the property transfer tax was repealed after, I think, was going to be repealed after 3 years when it was first passed. So it is a mechanism, but I think the value of ensuring that we have a system that can be equally, if not more appropriately designed to address this type of impact on our landscape is important. And I think the repeal process allows us to make sure that we're not left with an interim program that could run the risk of being less than adequate in addressing impacts of our trails network.
Trevor?
Yeah, I'm listening to this conversation. I'm trying to understand this section here about the repeal. When we're amending Section 310 BSA 6001, we're changing it. We're not adding to it, correct?
No, you're adding a new threshold under
Okay.
6001.
So that's what I'm trying to understand. So when we talk about repealing it, we're basically saying we're going to go back in and say, okay, you haven't done what you're supposed to do. We're taking that additional language back out, which basically will default back to status quo. Am I understanding that right?
Yes, so there is an existing Rule 71 as well as the existing commercial definition under Act 250. So, without this language, the other Act 250 jurisdictional triggers would be in place.
Would be.
Yeah.
Others who are around the table want to weigh in on this?
I agree with Gary. I think the sunset is well advised, and I think it'll also serve notice to all the folks out there who are involved in trail business that, you know, this is something this is a more or less a placeholder until something else is coming, and it's going to come because what's the placeholder is going to expire within by September 21st, 2021, September 1st, 2021. I don't know, it just would give me a sense of...
I keep saying that, it's actually not that date, it's the bottom date,
Isn't it
22. January 1, 2022.
Oh, I'm reading September 1.
That's the,
Sunset.
I think that's the criterion 8.
It's for the whole program.
That's criterion 8 of our underlying
Yeah.
bill. This is gonna be repealed January 1, 2022 if we adopt it.
I see. I am reading. Well, I still like the idea of the sunset.
Yes, having heard this, does this language do what, I mean, I guess I'm not connecting the dots on this.
I find this language to be very confusing, and so I'm not, I don't know. I don't know.
Jamie.
If I could just offer one read on this, and would certainly defer to Ellen if this is not the effect of this. But you start on line 6 on page 2. It says that this subdivision, meaning the language that follows, shall apply to construction of improvements made after July 1st of 2020. So it only applies to those, not to previous trail development that's been on the ground, because I know there's a concern about potentially having some jurisdictional effect to that.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next, and then right above that on line 3 through 5, it says this subdivision, meaning just this subdivision that follows, should be the exclusive mechanism for determining jurisdiction over new or proposed trails. That will be part of the Vermont trail system, not affecting trails looking backwards that may have been built. So again, the intent here was not to create some amnesty for a trail system that was built that should have gone through Act 250 and maybe through a JL would be deemed to be under Act 250. It's just saying moving forward now, for purposes of this subdivision, and now we're on lines 8 through 10, involved land for these new trail segments that are being built shall not include a trail that was constructed before. So that's the kind of connectivity issue. Do you go back and attach to the existing network and bring the whole network under Act 250 in this interim period for these new trail segments? Or do we offer clarity on this policy for this time period? And I would say that from our perspective, that's why we thought the sunset was so important, is we weren't comfortable with that being a long-term solution, but only one, because these questions may come up, to offer clarity for just the time being until we get what we think is an appropriate solution for the whole trail building issue. And that was part of the reason why we were encouraging the sunset, was to hold our feet to the fire so that we all collectively get this done and bring it to you in a timely manner, but also that some of us were uncomfortable making that a permanent policy on the books, but acknowledge some clarity is needed, at least in the interim, because these questions may come up. But certainly our intent, again, was not to go backwards, but I would defer to Ellen if this is not clear, or if you're all struggling with it, if there's a way to make it more clear. But I don't read it as retroactively going backwards, only new segments moving forward.
Maybe we need to say that. This does not apply to existing trail networks. Existing trail networks will remain as they are. Can we add that?
Sure.
That's what we need to do.
So I guess my response to that is, are any of these trails, do any of them have existing Act 250 permits that the connection to them would actually trigger a permit amendment? Because I guess, so if these things are going to be connected, wouldn't that be a material change to an existing Act 250 development? So, but they get to go, but the new segment won't be an amendment because they'll be under this special calculation.
That's how I would read it, but what do you think, Evan?
Greg?
I think that's a good question. I think it's a good question. I think there's certainly a possibility that an addition to an existing permitted Act 250 trail could be deemed to be a material change to that development.
Which is sort of related to my other confusion about subdivision 5, because if someone is building a brewery as a commercial development and there are recreational trails, the commercial development, that is the brewery, the land involved in that is all the land owned by the owner. So there could be trails on it, but they are potentially already permitted because they're a Vermont trail system trail.
There's no permit for the Vermont trail system trail.
Well, I'm just still I'm confused about that too, but.
Greg?
Yeah, I just wanted to address, I think, something I may have just heard you say. For Vermont trail system trails, as I think Warren was saying earlier, they benefit from the current jurisdictional triggers for municipal and state projects, and that's 10 acres of impact. So Vermont trail system trails can and should be permitted by Act 250, provided that their area of impact is greater than 10 acres.
Right, I was, yeah, thank you.
Now you know I've been up all night, every night, throughout the whole weekend.
Friday night,
Spinning our
Saturday
wheels
night,
on this.
Sunday night, Monday night.
But I think what gives me assurances is that this is an interim period for a short period of time to provide that clarity. We have consensus of the parties engaged about recognizing that we would be going back to the status quo if we didn't have that sunset provision. I think what we tried to do is foresee all the potential outcomes to avoid any game playing, and at the end of the day have a better, a more thoughtful, targeted approach on how we're going to be managing the impacts associated with trails moving forward. And I think it may not be perfect, but I think it's adequate for the purposes of providing greater clarity where we need it, without a moratorium and without exemptions. This is an interim period for a path forward.
Jim?
Pun intended.
Jim, what do you think?
Well, moratorium, that's a scary word, and it just got introduced 20 minutes ago. Not part of my decision here. I continue to feel, I've been reassured about much of the body of this amendment, thank you very much, and is it easy to get wrapped around the axle with it? Yes, it is. I continue to feel that there should not be a sunset, but if we go with a sunset, we need to remember that somebody's going to have to tell us to extend the sunset if it doesn't work. And I'm putting that out there because we've had to extend sunset after sunset. and go strictly to daylight saving times and beyond. So we gotta have that as a thought, and maybe legislative council can put that in her calendar to remind us in a couple of years. This is important, and I don't wanna squash an important thing. And even though I'm not totally in favor of 3-4 different lines here, and definitely not in favor of the sunset, because I think the agency can get this done, and actually can even say, we're gonna adopt everything we were talking about sunsetting, minus this or that, and add a bunch of other things. They've got the flexibility to make those recommendations, but I'm not making a motion to move this, but at the moment, but I think we do need to move it,
We have to move
and I
on.
don't think
Yeah.
we can get it perfect, and maybe the Senate can get it perfect, but at any rate, it needs to be in the bill as a placeholder for action at the very, very least, and we've gotta do something with it, so
I just wanna let Ellen talk. We do have to move on. We have other things to do, and Ellen's gonna leave us, and then she has to draft our amendment, so we have to wrap this up.
So I would say that you currently do not have possession of the bill, so this will be an individual amendment, so you have the option to not put your name on it, or to put your name on it,
Yeah.
whichever.
Well, we were talking about putting it in with our whole final amendments, so, thank you for that. You're right. We don't need to, it's gonna have one person's name on it anyway, the amendment hearing.
Do we need to have a motion then, or is it a straw vote? But I would
I
like
think
to
we
make,
can have a motion.
I would like to make a motion to approve this amendment,
I don't know how amendments work actually. Do we
or,
vote
or
on them officially?
to accept this amendment
So it's,
with my name on it.
We're not gonna make any changes.
well, so
What?
it's,
We're not gonna make any changes to it. Just add
Jesus,
that.
Carol, we've been talking about
I
it
know,
for an hour
but
and a half.
I know, I
Do you
feel
have a
like
change?
the clarity for the time period I like, but I feel more comfortable going back to the status quo and without sunset provisions, so
I do have a motion on the table. That's a conversation.
okay, second.
I'll second the motion.
Alright, so you're proposing clear language that would clarify that we go back to the status quo. Okay,
I'm seconding Gary's.
I understand. I'm trying to get clarity on what Carol was saying. So I guess now I'm confused. So you are now proposing language when a motion has been made. Can we just discuss and see who supports Carol's proposal of language to clarify that we go back to the status quo if it sunsets, or when?
I don't want it to sunset. I just want this,
Let's just, what, Jim?
Well, I think Trevor asked a question that actually, the answer helped me. If it sunsets and there has been no action or insufficient acts,
goes back to the status quo.
then the status,
Alright,
we go
fine.
back to the status quo anyway.
Okay, fine,
And I
fine.
think I'm seeing heads nod is that's what happens.
I'm comfortable with that.
Yes, and so that answers that.
Okay, thank you.
Alright. So, I learned that other committees go alphabetical around the table except for chair and vice chair. Oh, and then we do vice chair and chair.
Now we don't.
Let's go. Yeah, let's vote on it. Yeah, let's go. Call the roll.
all right, so, Representative Bates,
Yes.
Representative Dolan,
Yes.
Representative Hill,
Yes.
Representative LaFave,
Yes.
Representative McCullough,
Yes.
Representative Morgan,
Yes.
Representative Bodie,
Yes.
what?
Yes.
Representative Smith,
Yes.
Representative Squirrel, yes, Representative Terenzini,
I don't even know what the hell you're talking about, so,
The amendment, Trails Amendment.
yeah, okay.
Is that a yes? Okay, we're voting.
I know you are.
I believe he said yes. Did you say?
I said yes.
Did you?
Sorry, I didn't
Just
hear
wanna
you.
No,
clarify.
wait, wait, I didn't say nothing.
Oh, sorry, I'm sorry. I
I'm
didn't
just
mean
trying to
put-
figure this thing out, that's all.
Representative Schill,
Yes.
1100.
Oh, I don't know if he did.
What?
I don't know if, Mr. Terenzini had,
Tom didn't vote.
he didn't vote.
Are you abstaining, Tom?
Can't abstain. And committee.
So you either need a yes or a no or to leave
So
the room.
let me just ask Warren. Warren, is this a better bill, or is this a better amendment, or what is this?
Yes.
It is.
Yes.
Well, I rely on your,
Yeah, we're voting actually, just,
Yeah.
we need to.
well, put me down as a yes.
Yes.
Unanimous vote?
All right.
Nice.
Now write that down.
I love it.
Holy mackerel committee. Another proposal is on the table to, include village centers with some, I guess the way to say this is to provide village centers a path forward to having Act 250 exemptions if they meet the same qualifications as neighborhood development areas, essentially. And have you had a chance to draft that language? Okay.
No, I mean, I just saw it very recently. So,
This is also from Representative Dolan.
right, so the state board is going to imbue this enhanced designation? Is that the proposal? So I only glanced at it and I think this would be setting up this is a new procedure so that village centers can be given an enhanced designation which would give them Act 250 exemption.
Yes, with some qualifications,
Okay,
which were in that memorandum I sent you,
okay.
which included a duly adopted town plan, zoning and subdivision bylaws, zoning regulations, subdivision bylaws, including river quarter, in that memo.
Okay. So a subsection of towns that receive village center designation can also receive the enhanced designation.
Yes, if they have these in place.
Okay.
Matt?
In the original draft, that was by the committee, it exempted all designations?
No,
Okay.
we've never exempted all of them.
Okay.
I guess the idea here is really just to demonstrate to people who are reading the bill that they have a path forward to get an exemption. I have concerns about standing up a separate path to do that, and that's what Ellen has brought up. And I believe Kate McCarthy may be the only actual planner in the room.
I have to go.
Yeah.
So
All right. Well, I think we're gonna have another draft or possibly another request for you.
I'll be back
Thank you.
if anyone wants to join me. House approves.
No.